Hi, this is Dale Rhoda, and the topic of this short video is how can we clean what I call the ID variables in our survey dataset. When we're analyzing data from a cluster survey, it's super important that every respondent be counted in the correct cluster. We want their responses to be grouped together with those from the other respondents from their cluster. And if they appear in the wrong cluster, it will bias the results. It will contaminate the results. So we want to spend some time right at the start of the data cleaning exercise, making sure that every respondent has values of the stratum ID and the cluster ID, and also the household ID probably, and the respondent ID or the occupant ID. So I call these variables together, I call them the ID variables, or sometimes in database language they might be considered key variables, because together, when you string them together, they form a unique key, and no two rows in the data set should have the same value, the same combination of, let's say, stratum ID, cluster ID, household ID, and respondent or occupant ID. That combination should be unique. And so we want to check and make sure everyone has a value for the ID variables, and we want to make sure that the combinations are unique, and we want to make sure they're correctly assigned. So the first thing I do in data cleaning is to check and see if there are any missing values. And if they are missing, we need to fill them in. We can often use some auxiliary information that's recorded with the survey. We may have recorded for each interview the interviewer ID, the supervisor ID, the date of the interview. If we were using a tablet, we might have recorded the device ID and the latitude, longitude. We can sort the data set based on these auxiliary variables, and we can probably place the missing interview. If we know it happened on November 19th and the interviewer ID was 27 and the supervisor ID was 6, well, we know that that team was in cluster 45 on that day, and so we can assign the appropriate cluster ID. Once all of the observations in the data set have a value for the key variables, then we want to make sure that they are unique and that they are correct. So we would use a command to check to see, make sure there are no duplicates. If there are duplicates, we need to figure out what to do about that. Is the record actually duplicated and we can drop one, or is one of the values wrong? And again, we would sort by the ID variables, and we would look for contradictions in what we already know. We already know which teams were in which clusters on which days, and so we can use that information to find contradictions and to correct them. And when the data includes a latitude-longitude field, then we can maybe plot the interview locations and use that geographic information to find outliers as well. Here's an example of a stratum mapped in gray, and where we expect the cluster latitude and longitudes to fall within the stratum boundaries. And we see for the most part they do, but there are several here that fall outside the boundaries. So we're going to need to check and see, do these represent survey responses from other clusters that were misentered? Does it represent a problem with the quality of the GPS latitude-longitude data? It's not clear from the map what the problem is, but it's clear that there is some sort of a problem here with data quality. And so we can sometimes use geographic information to help with the ID variables. I want to spend a minute to talk about paper forms, because there's a key moment when you have the power to do a tremendous amount of good with very little work. You know, it's common for the teams to collect the data on the paper forms and to put them in an envelope that represents responses from this particular cluster. And then that envelope or that folder is sent back to headquarters, where the data managers will at some point unpack the envelope and lay out the forms and mix them with those from other clusters. At that moment, when you unpack the envelope, it's worthwhile to take a few extra minutes and make sure that every form that comes out of the envelope is clearly marked with the correct stratum ID and cluster ID, because you can easily make corrections at this point. You can correct typos, you can clarify unclear handwriting, or you can fill in values if they happen to be missing. This is a moment when it's very easy to know which cluster the form came from and to write it clearly on there. If you miss that moment and you mix up the forms, then it can be very painful. It's a lot of work to then go back afterwards. Sometimes it's many hours of work, sometimes it's several days of work to go back and assign the ID variables correctly. So take advantage of that moment, build it into your plans and your protocol, and train the person who will unpack the envelopes to to use that moment to clarify the data quality. There's an additional bonus video that you can watch here in this series. We have developed some resources for WHO to help make sure that the stratum ID and the cluster ID are recorded accurately in the first place. We have some tips for teams who are using paper, and we have some tips for teams who are using touchscreen technology. So look for that bonus video, and you can download the zip file, and it has a lot of resources in it for helping to get things right from the very start. As with the other videos in the series, if you have any questions, please let us know, and we'll be happy to engage with you on your questions. Thanks very much.